Cube Sunday morning. I'm Bob Brown. Now, a special case today on this story. I am broadcasting from the newsroom of CBS in 1968. No, 73, looking at the colors.
Say hi to Walter Cronkite for me, will you?
Oh, God, if you'd have given me a minute, I could have pulled off a Walter Cronkite impression. But now all I can think of is the fact that the last trusted man on TV. Um, could you imagine if Walter Cronkite had to watch 6 hours of Fox?
He would have gouged out his eyes.
Yeah, there would be no more Walter Cronkite. It would be like Event Horizon.
Oh, God. Oh, man. There is a story there where the ghost of Walter Cronkite possesses Sean Hannity. And gives one honest newscast.
Heads over squat. Well, if it's 1973, I'm not here. I'm marching in an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. That's what.
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, 73. The Vietnam War was finally. I guess the military-industrial complex had enough yachts. And let it go. Hey, don't laugh. You get me going on something like that. This is Cliff's week. But watching Elizabeth Warren this week as people complain about inflation, I was talking to one of our editors and saying, yeah, here it is. She has executives standing up at shareholder meetings and saying inflation has been good to us because it's given us cover for raising our prices. And, God help us. So, as long as we're saying God help us, Cliff, that brings you in. Tell us about what we're going to do today, because otherwise I'll go on a rant, and you don't want me on a rant.
No, can't have that. All right, so good morning, everyone. Today's topic is books and stories and poems and plays that stick with you, that are memorable, that become part of your life and part of your psyche. Why do some books you read and then a year later you can reread them and it's like reading them for the first time? Or why are other books like, you find yourself thinking about it while you're driving, like years after you first read it or decades after you first read it? And the same with stories. And I think that, it's pretty clear that sometimes you come across a work of fiction that resonates with you at that moment. And that's part of it. And that is just a connection that you form with the work of fiction. Other times it's just that, like, you're young and maybe you're encountering this idea or concept or way of telling a story for the first time. But there are other things like, I read stuff, in my 40s and like that I'm still, very strongly resonant. I know Deborah has some books. I have a couple of books I could share about that. But before I do that, let me introduce my guests. We have returning with us Andrew Roberts, poet, writer, bagpipe player, the author of the epic poem about World War I and also kind of sort of Vietnam, Durham and Rose. And then we also have a writer and all around wonderful human being, Deborah J. Ross, who wrote sometimes as Deborah Wheeler, but is currently, I think, just using Deborah J. Ross, and has written a number of novels and short stories. You can find her work in finer bookstores. She is a Lambda Literary finalist for her novel Collaborators. And you can read a whole bunch of her science fiction and other fiction in various places at the novel and short length. All right. So, is that anything else you want me to say about y'all's bios?
We're both really good looking.
You're both fabulous,
You're so
fabulous looking.
Yeah.
You are ruggedly handsome, and she is classically beautiful. So there you go.
I think what I want. So if Andrew's bagpipe player, I'm a piano player.
No, that's true.
Although right now I am working on, it's like the intermediate advanced level of the theme from Game of Thrones. And let me tell you, if you are a piano player, that is a total hoot to play. I highly recommend it.
Actually, during the lockdown, my kids got like that Simply Piano app and started all playing. And it's really, and they would just play whatever, pieces were suggested. And so, like, when your like 6-year-old is playing the Game of Thrones theme, it's pretty like a simplified version, but it's pretty. There's cognitive dissonance there.
I'm still looking forward to using my electric chanter and jamming with you on your sitar. So
yeah. Actually, both of you have had the experience, I think, right, of reading while I play sitar. So that's another thing they have in common. I'm a sitar player, and I sometimes play sitar at conventions like BayCon, and then I sometimes get my writer friends to read stuff over sitar as a collaborative artwork, and that's always fun.
Yeah, my poems have never sounded better.
That's because I drowned them out. No, the sitar is a quiet instrument.
Yeah. I know we're supposed to be talking about books that stuck with us, but I think it's remarkable that all three of us are writers and musicians, and that it's like cross training for creative people. That sometimes your brain is in words and sometimes your brain is in music.
I think we're just bohemians.
So I'm going to start us off on topic from that segue. So this is a book by Michael Moorcock. Now, he's written the Elric books and a lot of other books that have stuck with me over decades. But this one, which also has an accompanying album called, from his band, The Deep Fix, called Live at the Terminal Cafe, which is the musical version of these stories, has stuck with me. It's set in Biloxi, Mississippi, in a weird future where there's sort of the world's falling apart. It's called the Biloxi Fault. And there are these gambler characters who are the protagonists of the story. And years after the book came out, and there's this is the British edition. The American edition doesn't have nearly the nice cover art. He came out with an album, a CD, called Live from the Terminal Cafe, which is the cafe near the Biloxi Fault in the series. And he's Michael Moorcock is a musician and a singer, and he does the vocals and with a bunch of musicians. And so that's I have the CD downstairs. I'm not gonna run and get it, but I can show you the cover in a minute, as I'm typing quickly on my phone. Somebody do a tap dance there we are, Live at the Terminal. Thank you. So here is the Apple Music version. Note that similar. It's the same cover art as the British paperback and hardcover, and it's so here he is. The music sticks. It's catchy. The music. It's normally Michael Moorcock's music is like space rock. He did a lot of work with Hawkwind and some with Blue Oyster Cult, but this album is kind of bluegrass. So it's and Cheryl asked, does it have to be a sci-fi book? No, we will be talking about all sorts of things. But I started with Michael Moorcock because he's written a lot of things that stuck with me, both in terms of the prose and the stories. And this universe is just whack. And there are 3 books in it and 1 album. So that's my segue. Somebody talk about and why does this resonate with me? Because it's set in Mississippi, and I grew up mostly in Tennessee. And I was in Memphis, and it is on some ways a world away from Biloxi, but also in some ways is not. And so I felt a connection there, and I also liked just the weird beauty of both his ideas and his prose, and it's partly set in New Orleans, where I used to go on vacations, and yeah, and it's just, I'm not going to read some of it, but it's really cool. All right, that's the discussion. So, Andrew, Deborah, either one of you want to talk about a work that has resonated with you?
Well, I'm going to talk about how I divided works.
Okay.
So there's, sometimes you read a book as an adult, and the stunningness of the prose and the story and the theme just stays with you. But there are books that stay with you because you read them, or in my case, my mother read them to me as a child, and books that you read when you were coming of age. And if you first read them as an adult, they might not have made that big an impression, but because they were the right book at the right time. So I'm just going to start with two books that my mother read to me. And one is, oh God, it's copyright 1937. It's called Red Feather, and it's by Marjorie Fisher. And there's the illustration on the title page that sort of encapsulates it. It's a changeling story where a human baby and a fairy baby are switched. But there's an interruption during this handover process, and the fairies grab a baby, and the girls come of age, and nobody knows if the change was really made. So you have two characters who feel that they don't belong, and it's their journey to try to figure out who they are and where they belong. And when I read it, it's my comfort reading because it's about acceptance and accepting yourself and finding your place. And I hear my mother's voice. The second this is by Marjorie Torrey, and I hope I can find a picture. It's called Artie and the Princess. And Artie is a baby dragon, and it's got these gorgeous, gorgeous pictures. And there he is with his friend, the princess, watering plants. And it just, it's not just that it's a childhood book. It's a really sweet story. There are messages about nonviolent conflict resolution that I can appreciate as an adult. And there's messages of friendship and standing up for your friends and standing up for who you are and controlling your temper, which for a baby dragon is really important. So those are my two books that stuck with me as a child. And I'll shut up now, and then I'll come back to the next one, which was coming of age stories. And then I also have some poetry and some nonfiction that I keep coming back to. But I don't want to monopolize. So.
I'm delighted by how prepared and organized you
are. You knew what I was like.
I know. That's one of the reasons I had you on, because that's obviously not me, right? Anyway, Andrew.
Well, as an agent of chaos, unprepared for anything. It's funny. I didn't really start with short stories when I started reading. I just started with novels, but I remember
Against Wake, age 3.
I remember a short story that was read to us in school, and I've yet to be able to find it anywhere. And it takes place during the Rising in Dublin, and it's two sharpshooters, two snipers, trying to kill each other. And it's from the one point of view of one of the IRA soldiers, and he's in awe of this other shooter, and he gets him, and then he has to see who it is, and it turns out to be his brother. And it's like, that was, I think the reason it stuck with me is I've got lots of brothers, and I don't know who wrote it. I don't know what it's called, but that story has stuck with me since about the 5th grade. Yeah, back when we were in school, we didn't have trigger warnings.
You had actual literal triggers.
Yeah.
In the story.
Well, no.
In the story.
But when I did start reading short stories, they were mostly given to me by my brother Joe, and he started me off with Lovecraft. And of all Lovecraft's short stories, I always liked The Cats of Ultar.
That's a good one.
The one where the little boy has the kitten, and then he's a gypsy, right? The old-fashioned word, right? But he comes into the town, and there's the mean old couple, and they torture and kill the kitten. So he invokes the old ones, and all the cats disappear. And they're gone for a while. When they come back, they're all fat and happy. And then you find out later on they ate the old couple. So that's the sort of things that turn a 13-year-old boy into a reader.
Yeah, well, I was one of those 12-year-old kids who read Chessmen of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs and made his own Jetton set.
Me too.
I didn't have anyone to play it with because I didn't have any brothers or sisters. But
the short story of all the short stories that I've ever read that sticks with me the most, it was read in my first writing class at our local community college, and the instructor Jackson Conley was just great, and he read this story called The Upturned Face by Stephen Crane. And that story changed my whole perception of how to write character. Because in the story, it's during the Civil War. Stephen Crane wrote The Red Badge of Courage, right? In this story, you have these officers and a few enlisted men, and they're burying another officer while they're under fire by sharpshooters. Seems to be a theme here with me. And it's the interaction as they're burying this man, and it's what's hidden is up front, or it's not. You have this mask up front, and what's hidden is being revealed by their actions, and they're all talking, and there's this false bravado and stuff, and then as they're burying the body, as the first shovel comes in, it kind of pendulums and swings, and it drops on his feet, and I remember the line is. That was a triumph, right? It was an important thing because by the end of the story, it's just the face, and they have to bury the face. But in that whole metaphor for these men in a time of war, while they're burying their comrade, they're all hidden. Who they are is hidden, but it's revealed by the innuendo and the side things, and that was really dangerous story for me to hear read when I was 18, because I was ready to just go gung-ho like a new Edgar Rice Burroughs or a Michael Moorcock or something, and all of a sudden I realized, wow, I think I want to write stuff other than science fiction. and I want to write character, and it ruined me because that's all I can do now.
Well, Michael Moorcock wrote stuff other than science.
I know, but I mean, in my high school days, the furthest away from science fiction was, I started reading Steinbeck, which also had its effect. But that story was when I said, I got when my instructor said, and he says, "You're writing, right? You want to focus on the character, because if you get the characters right, they'll do all the heavy lifting." Mm-hmm. And that was in the class right after he read that story, and I'm sitting there just going, "Hallelujah, I'm a believer, man."
That's nice.
And it's a short piece, and it absolutely changed how I write.
One of the things that affected me from my school days was Steinbeck, in particular, The Grapes of Wrath, which is a book that I've I had to read it in school, but I come back to it. And certainly it opens with a chapter on the dust. right? And it just describes the dust and the effect of the dust. And there are no human characters. The dust is the character. And, in many ways, the antagonist in the book. And then he goes through, like, the next chapter is about the Jodes. And then every other chapter is about the Jodes. And every other chapter is this expansive view. And it kind of blew my mind because it was a different way of writing a novel, right? Where you didn't just focus on events. You could, like, leave your story completely and just have a chapter about whatever that had some vague tie-in. When they made the movie, they took some of those chapters and put the Jodes in them, right? So that, because you're making a movie. But in the original book, they're not in there. Tom Joad is not in this scene or that scene or whatever, and just the idea of the dust, is something I think about. Like, many years later, when I was dating my wife, she is a medical doctor, and she used to do volunteer to help out with the medical stuff at Burning Man, and so I went with her, and the dust, the fine playa dust, was very similar to the description of Steinbeck. So I kept thinking about Grapes of Wrath while I was at Burning Man, because that's how my brain works.
Grapes of Wrath meets Mad Max.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
I think it's interesting, the books that we're forced to read in school, and some of them, if we read at a different time, would really connect. I think that nobody in high school should ever be allowed to read Jane Austen. You're just not ready for it. I remember just loathing Pride and Prejudice. Why do Darcy's so obnoxious? What is she seeing? And the prose was opaque to me. But when I picked it up in my 30s, it was like, oh my God, this is so amazing.
See, my goal as a writer, Cliff knows this one, is to go into half-price books or a used bookstore and see a copy of my book Durham and Rose on the shelf and opening it up and seeing all the anger scribbled in it by some teacher. Forced to read it.
I think it would be a great book for school. It should be taught. Another book that I read in school that I loved, that it resonated with me and that I loved, was The Great Gatsby. And I thought it was really cool in a kind of a science fiction-y way. I mean, it really does. I mean, it takes place in a kind of parallel universe. The East Egg and the West Egg don't really exist, and kind of in our universe. But like the descriptions of, like, the sort of the alternate planet where the working is, and the guy with the glasses staring down at everyone. And it was a very creepy description. And then I reread it and loved it even more when I was older, and could appreciate the way that he put it together, right? Like, as a kid, I was just like sort of in that dream fugue state, reading it, like watching the movie in my head kind of thing. And then reading it later, I was like, oh, wow, that's how he did that. Oh, my goodness, that's amazing, And then you go back and you think, and he wrote it all on a typewriter. Like, how did he
What's
do that?
wild is
or
he had a typewriter.
Yeah, longhand or a typewriter.
Well,
but
well, he had the best editor that ever lived, I think, Max Perkins.
Wow.
Who was Hemingway's, and
Sure.
I can't remember what's the author's name who wrote The Yearling. And Cross
Marjorie Rollins.
Yes.
Rollins.
Yeah. So I mean, and Tom Wolfe. That was his other. Max Perkins.
Thomas Wolfe. Right.
Yeah. Wrong Tom Wolfe.
The Thomas Wolfe. Yeah, his later books I don't think were edited, and that shows. But Look Homeward Angel is another one that I read in school that has stuck with me over the years.
So the books that I had to read in school, I was a omnivorous reader, so I read them, but I didn't come back to them until later. So I go to the library, and I was horse crazy and animal crazy, so I read dog stories and horse stories, lots of horse stories. And I tried science fiction, and I absolutely bounced off people like Heinlein. I mean, later at college, I read him because everybody else was reading Stranger in a Strange Land, and I'm going, why am I reading this? But
Boy, I felt the same way.
if it was just, Heinlein, and I think I tried Clark, and there were a couple of other authors in the library. And then I picked up this book that had a horse on the cover, and it was The Beastmaster by Andre Norton.
Oh yeah.
And that was transformative. I was absolutely in love. First of all, it had horses in it and telepathic bonds with wonderful animals. But it was also the main character was not only native, but Earth had been destroyed. So his home was gone and he didn't fit. And it's the same thing as the Red Feather. And for a teenager going through, who the hell am I in my life? Who am I? What do I want? It was just perfect. And so I used to have dreams of going to, this was when in a grocery store by the cash registers, they'd have the spinner racks of paperback books, which were like 25, 35 cents, maybe 50 cents. Of going to my local store and finding a whole rack of new Andre Norton novels.
There were a ton.
Idea. Wonderful.
Yeah, she wrote what had to be the most underrated and one of the absolute best fantasy books ever written, The Year of the Unicorn, which is just brilliant. And probably written in the 60s, early 70s, but the protagonist was a really strong woman, which is unheard of back then in science fiction and fantasy. At that point, everyone was trying to do either Conan or Tolkien, but it was one of the Witch World books, but it was a standalone, and it was so good.
For those who didn't live through the 1970s, let me tell you the weirdest thing in hindsight, other than seeing Bob today in the 1970s, was, and it felt normal at the time because it was normal at the time, going to like science fiction section of a bookstore or whatever and looking at the paperbacks, and by number, the science fiction section was basically the Andre Norton, John Norman section. Because John Norman's Gore books were huge. I cannot explain to you how popular they were.
Yeah.
They were and there were like 20 of them. And they were next to Andre Norton, who was also prolific because they're next to each other alphabetically. And so you'd see like Gore, Witch World, they're like right next to each other on the shelf. And it would be a whole shelf because we're talking 50 books.
Yeah.
And so that was, and I, being like a kid, I was just like picking it all up and looking at it as if it were all the same. But there were and it was a microcosm of the change in science fiction and fantasy happening in the 1970s because of feminism and the reaction against that change, both juxtaposed alphabetically because of their last names.
But the 1970s was this amazing birth explosion of writing by women, not just Andre Norton, but that's about the time that I discovered C.J. Cherryh, Susan Charnish, Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough, Sherry Tepper, Tanith Lee started publishing about that.
Well, Le Guin too was all over the place.
Yeah.
But C.J. Cherryh, she wrote one of my favorite short stories, The Only Death in the City, in the Sunfall paperback. Yeah. Keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Of all the wonderful Ursula Le Guins, I mean, I think anyone who's read Those Who Walk Away from Omelas will always be eternally walking away from Omelas. But The Lathe of Heaven, which is not one of her, best known books, but was somehow adapted into two separate TV movies. The Lathe of Heaven, I love that to the point where I have a puppet, like one of those realistic animal puppets of a sea turtle that I play with the kids, and the puppet sings to the kids. And I named the sea turtle Ursula because the aliens in the Lathe of Heaven resemble sea turtles. And so so Ursula is a character in my kids' lives because I play this turtle and sing bedtime songs as the turtle. So yeah, so Lathe of Heaven is a book I've read and reread, and it was made into two made for TV. It was the first movie ever made by PBS.
It's great.
In the 1970s, and that's great.
Yeah.
And they thought they had lost it forever, and then someone found one copy on like the big videotapes that they used to distribute, and they transferred it to DVD as best they could. And that then, which I bought immediately, and it went out of print, but it's all the full length thing is on YouTube, as well as the 20-minute interview with Ursula from the time. That's also a DVD extra. That's also on YouTube. Both very much worth watching. And then years later, they made it. Someone else made it like a mini series about it, and it was terrible. And it didn't even have the aliens. I mean, it was just like, what are you thinking? Yeah. So anyway, if you want to watch the video version of Lathe of Heaven, go find the original. It's on YouTube. It's free.
In the comments, somebody brought up a little while ago Marguerite Henry in terms of animals, and she was a first love of mine also. And how could we forget Anne McCaffrey?
Yeah.
You know, her Kern series changed so much in terms of the sensibility of fantasy. Actually, when I was thinking about books that stuck with me, yes, of course, Dragon Riders, the whole Kern series, but she wrote a book called Restoree, where a woman, a modern Terran woman, gets basically kidnapped off Central Park and taken to this other planet where, because she doesn't understand the language and she's been physically scarred by the experience, they decide that she's been captured that she's traumatized. First she's stupid, then she's traumatized by the experience of being basically flayed by these aliens, other aliens, and nobody remains sane after that. Anyway, she recovers, she learns the language, she becomes a mover and a shaker in terms of the power structure on that planet, and it's an empowerment story. But it's also, what if you woke up on a non-human planet and you didn't know the customs and you had no relationships and no teachers, you didn't know the language, how would you survive?
Wow.
Yeah, that really has stuck with me. And Elizabeth Lynn was writing at that time too. Names are just popping in.
What was the name of that book you just described?
Restoree.
Restoree. Huh, I've never heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Anne McCaffrey?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's a complete standalone.
Wow. Yeah, I'm gonna go with another thing. I've been admiring the bookshelf behind Andrew, and I'm gonna hold this up, which I read to my older kids so far. My younger kid isn't quite there yet. But yeah, this stuck with me. It's also a book about World War I, and on some level, and I just loved. I remember reading it and reading the description of the dwarves whose beards were so long they tucked them into their belts, and I decided then and there that was a life goal. So my wife doesn't like it when my beard gets too long, but at some point maybe when I'm really old, you get it, long enough to tuck into my belt. But yeah, that my introduction to Tolkien was actually, there was a short-lived magazine in the 1970s done by Reader's Digest called Children's Digest, and my parents subscribed to me, and there was over 2 issues an illustrated version of Riddles of the Dark, chapter 4, Riddles in the Dark, and I read it, and I wish I had those issues. I mean, we just threw it out in the move, and you can't find them. those two particular issues, it's chapter 5. Those two particular issues you can't find because collectors all want it. But it was illustrated by one of the guys who animated the Hobbit animated TV show.
Rankin and Bass.
Rankin Bass animator, who did the illustrations for the children's diary. And I can still see them in my mind, even though I haven't, laid eyes on that magazine in over 45 years. Probably 50 years actually. So that was my introduction, and I had to find out what happened next. Because it's just the whole chapter of Bilbo and Gollum. And so I went and read the book. My dad had the paperback, and and then my dad did this wonderful thing. The biggest understatement in history was stated by my dad, where I had read and loved his paperback of The Hobbit, and then one day after work, I'm like in my room on my bed reading. Shocking, I know. And my dad comes in at the door, and I can still remember where the door was and the dresser was. And he said, "So, did you know that there is a sequel to The Hobbit?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Thunk!" with the whole Lord of the Rings trilogy in the paperback that was this thick, the 3 books. And I was like, so there you go. Biggest understatement ever.
Yes. Well, my introduction to The Hobbit was actually when I was in college in the late 60s. And one of my classmates, who, by an interesting coincidence, is a very, very distant cousin by marriage, who was a fellow biology and music major, did a radio version of reading of The Hobbit. He didn't edit it at all. He got classmates to read roles, and then the narrative was done by an exchange student from England, so in this wonderful British accent. And Dan, his name is Dan Rubin, and you can find him online. He's still a musician, although he lives in Newfoundland, I think now. Anyway, he wrote wonderful settings for the songs, as good as Howard Shore's, I think. And yeah, really, really wonderful music that picks you up and carries you along. And I was in it, but also we all would tune on our radios to the college station on, I think it was Sunday night, and listen to it.
Nice.
So yeah.
So I've listened to, there's a couple of full cast recordings, radio adaptations of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and they had their own music, for the various things, like Beyond the Misty Mountains, and that some of those tunes stuck with me. And also, I'm not sure his first name, Donald Swan, who did the piano player, friend of Tolkien's, who did The Road Goes Ever On.
And the book about the music of
he set Tolkien with Tolkien's permission, right? And there are some recordings, and I had this on cassette of all things, of Tolkien reading some of his poetry from the Lord of the Rings, and also reading some scenes, including Treebeard. And I never got Treebeard's dialogue. It never made any sense to me until I heard Tolkien reading it. And so then it's oh, that's what he sounds like. He's going like that. And you have to do it that way, or it just doesn't transcribe right. But that's a transcription of going, yes.
He was C.S. Lewis.
Oh, yeah. I think it's a measure of the strength of the poetry and the poetry, the lyrics, that it lends itself so beautifully to musical settings.
Yeah.
Have you read The Lays of Beleriand?
It's on my bookshelf.
Yeah, I love the poetic version of. There's just a fragment, but it's the story of Beren and Luthien when they go for the Silmarils, and it's all in poetry. And I'm a child of Homer. So I read that and I just okay. Lays of Beleriand, favorite Tolkien ever. But it's funny. This is actually one of my favorite Tolkien books,
Oh yeah.
Smith of Wooten Major, and the short story is actually really cool. And if you haven't read it, I'm not going to spoil it. I recommend reading it because when I was in high school and finished reading The Lord of the Rings, this was it. And maybe The Tolkien Reader was a few other things, and that was it to read of Tolkien.
Right.
But this was a really when I was younger, I read, okay, it's not The Lord of the Rings, okay. But when I read it when I was older, like you had talked about earlier, some things are different when you read it. Also, this is brilliant. It is a beautiful story. So, Tolkien.
Yeah. Those who live in the Bay Area are familiar with Margaret and Christoph, who were part of Brocéliande and Avalon Rising, and they did a version of music from Tolkien, which they released as the album The Starlit Jewel with the permission of the Tolkien estate, which is their own take. So it's got like a very lively version of the Hobbit washing song and things like that, and it's just a really it's a jewel if you can find a copy of The Starlit Jewel by Brocéliande.
So poetry wise, who are some of your influences and poems from poetry?
Well, Wilfred Owen, duh. You and I have talked about that. Dulce et decorum est is a big one.
Ulysses by Tennyson, I think is.
Oh yeah, that's another one. Yeah. I read that to my friends on my 40th birthday because I felt so old on my 40th birthday. I was a kid, but I read all of that to strive to seek to find and not to yield. I love both the resignation and the toughness of that.
Le Guin has a beautiful book of poetry. Finding My Elegy. If any of you get a hold of that, read it. It's wonderful. I think she was, I love her books. I love Lady of Heaven and Left Hand of Darkness. Love the Earthsea books, but her poetry is my favorite of her stuff. What about you, Deborah?
Well, I was forced, I learned, I memorized a whole bunch of poems in high school because both my favorite English teacher, who I had for 2 years, and my favorite French teacher, who I also had for 2 years, required it. And I can still recite at least bits and pieces. And I think it was the Louis Untermeyer compilation, like the Great Book of Great Poems or something like that. So I can't, I'm sure once I started reciting in English and in French, things would come to me. Right now, my comfort poetry actually is Mary Oliver. And she's not the world's greatest poet, but her poems are so emotionally resonant with me that so I just grabbed my book, and you can see it's got bookmarks. Current 2 favorite poems are Wild Geese, the one that begins, "You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert, repenting." That's
nice.
And it's not more. Is it marked? It's The Journey. The Journey. That's the one that talks about the only life you can save is your own. And Egrets. Unruffled by their faith, not logic, they opened their wings softly and stepped over every dark thing. I mean, she just speaks to me right now. And that's really interesting because I think the poems that I loved as a child, I forget the editor, 1,000 Poems for Children, were different from the poems that really connected me with me in high school. One of the poems that we memorized was became the basis for Debussy's Clair de Lune, which is what I'm another piece that I'm playing right now. And the poem rings in my mind as I play this, because it's not all sweet moonlight. It's that twist of darkness and the craziness that underlies the poem. And those poems have given way to, I guess in college, Robert Bly and Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen just really spoke to me. And now it's Mary Oliver. So it just, the poems that speak to us change as we move through our lives. Yeah, I think that's the only poetry I have. But in a sort of segue to nonfiction, one of the books that I keep coming back to, and I think this is my second copy, is Honey from the Rock, 10 Gates of Jewish Mysticism by Lawrence Kushner. And it's short essays, and there's some Hebrew, which I can sound out, but I can't read, but enough English, and I can just pick it up and read a paragraph or two, and then I have to go away and think about it for 2 weeks, because it's a way for me of connecting text and lived spiritual experience. So that's that book I keep coming back to. And while I'm on a roll,
go for it.
Yeah, Charlotte Castle has 2 books, and the first one is If the Buddha Dated, which looks like that, and then the second one is If the Buddha Married. And the reason these are important to me is it's about integrity, spiritual integrity in relationships. And I think that's, at least for me, that is a lifetime journey, because it starts with your integrity with yourself. And that becomes the place from which you relate to other people.
Nice.
And also Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, To Heal a Fractured World, The Ethics of Responsibility. And my copy is completely marked up. And I come back and I reread it very slowly every 4 or 5 years, and find all kinds of things. And that's the connections within ourselves, which is, I think, why Mary Oliver speaks so much to me right now. Our relationships. And so we start with the integrity within ourselves, self-honesty, really being inside of our own skin. And we relate to other people. And this is how we take that out into the world, and how we put our core values into action and hold ourselves accountable, and make the world a better place. I talk about increasing the goodness in the world, whether it's speaking kindly to a homeless person, or helping out a friend, or writing great books, or going on a peace march, or whatever, writing to the president, giving him a piece of my mind, whatever it happens to be. It's different levels of the same thing. And I aspire to write books that connect with that process and with other people, and help make their lives a little bit more good in the world.
I think Tolstoy would approve.
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
So just go back to talking about Jewish sources, but on poetry, and it's the most famous one, but Psalm 23. So I walk through the shadow of the valley of death. And when I was a kid, I thought that referred to Death Valley, California. But anyway, because why not, right? And I still have that connection in my head between.
I'm sure some Frontiers people going through Death Valley Thought of that psalm many times.
So yeah, both in Hebrew, in the Hebrew original, and in translation, Psalm 23 is just, and I don't even theologically like the idea of God as a shepherd because that makes us into sheep, and you don't want to be sheep. Not just like the metaphorically, but literally, like.
I don't mind being a sheep if God's my shepherd. I mean,
Well,
if Trump was my shepherd,
know.
that'd be a little different story.
It depends on what the plan is. Yeah, it's exact. Mutton is good, Bob says, right? So, like, do you want to be mutton or do you want to be sheared and make wool? That's fine, but mutton, not so much. Anyway, but it's still just as poetry, a beautiful piece. I figure I found a button, and I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna unmirror my camera because, boom, it defaults to mirror. So I can show you book covers that hopefully backwards.
Context. When you talked about the 23rd Psalm, I think context is everything, because as Deborah was saying, it's that poetry is a personal thing, right? Well, David was a shepherd.
Sure.
And who was his shepherd? I think that was the context of it.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of psalms like, I'm hiding in a cave writing poetry with my enemies surrounding me. God, would you please smite them for me so I can go be king and not be hiding in a cave? That's generally, but this poem is not one of those. We've talked a lot about what hit us early on. I'm going to talk about, this is a story that I think was first in Asimov's, and I want to say, let me see if I can find the copyrights on the individual stories in this book, but science fiction. And yeah, I can't find it. It would have been about 20 years ago, but only about 20 years ago, a story called Softly Spoke the Gabble Duck, which is by Neil Asher and collected in The Gabble and Other Stories. That is an artist's interpretation of a gabble duck on the cover. And it's a really kind of, it's a brutal story about big game hunters who go to this planet. It's the point of view character is the hunter who is shepherding two spoiled rich people who want to do big game hunting on this planet, and their target is a gabble duck, which is a particularly large, dangerous animal. And what happens as a result of this big game hunt safari on this alien planet. And it's stuck with me because just sort of the mystery, and he actually does clear up in one of the other stories. There's a sequel story in here about what the origin story of gabble ducks are as a species. And it's dark because it's Neil Asher and he writes dark stuff. But that stuck with me. Like, I read that, and I can still see the illustration in my head that may or may not actually be what it really looked like, but I could see it. I could see the characters, and there are some things that hit, even at older ages. I know there was one Neuromancer blew my mind when I first read it in the 80s because it was such a fresh thing, right? I'd started with his short stories, William Gibson's short stories, and then the second book was out already, Count Zero. And I really, I loved parts of Count Zero, but Count Zero was one of those books where, like, the author had 3 point of view characters and rotates, and then and one of the 3 point of view characters, Turner, I think, I just didn't resonate with him at all. So, like, I didn't like his chapters. So about a third of the book I was not really into, and the other 2/3 I loved. I loved Bobby. But there was early chapter from Turner's point of view where they were doing a raid. They were extracting a scientist from one company to take to their company. And one of the people who was doing the raid, and this would have been about 1985 when he wrote this book, was a lesbian who had a child with her partner that was the genetic combination of the two of them because they had the gene editing technology to do that. And that was the first time I thought I'd ever encounter that in science fiction. I thought, well, that's cool, right? And so that bit from one of the Turner chapters were like, I didn't care about Turner. I cared about her, right? I wanted her story, the story of her and her partner and their kid, who was genetically related to both mothers. But that stuck with me because it was so important. At that, I was in college, and it was important when I read it, that I was forming my own identity and my own figuring out my sexual orientation, figuring out what I wanted in life and whether I wanted kids. And this was all, it hit me right then, right? That this possibility was one thing that science fiction, we haven't talked about. One of the things that, because we've talked about science fiction, we've talked about non-science fiction books and stories, but one of the things that science fiction does is create possibilities that you can't get in another formula, also fantasy, right? And so these possibilities, especially when you're young, are really important because they suggest, well, the world doesn't actually have to be this way. Right? Like, we can imagine a different world, and what would that be like? Maybe better, maybe worse, right? I know dystopia is very popular with teenagers for some reason, because horrible situation, some teenager changes the world and makes it better, right? Empowered. So you get empowerment, and I mean, it's like, it's quite the power drug for teenagers to be able to read that story. And it's a good story, because even if it's not realistic that like one teenager is going to change the whole world, some teenagers some teenagers win Nobel Prizes, for good reason, for work that they do that does change the world, right? So I think we're getting near the end of our hour, so Bob will probably reappear sometime soon. I am invoking Bob. Back
Bob is back
from the 1970s, still in the 1970s.
Speak of the devil, and the devil appears.
Yes.
Hey, I like the 1970s in a way. I mean, we had Jimmy Carter was president. We had discovered that our post-World War II dominance was coming to an end as the Arab oil embargo, a generation of full employment was coming to an end. The Rust Belt was finding out what happened when you didn't sink corporate profits back into upgrading and updating your equipment, your manufacturing systems. It was a time of learning. Oh, God. But
and also the Bee Gees.
And boys like myself could see, share Tony, Orlando, and Don, and those kind of images on TV that now you have to go to MTV to find, or something.
A yellow ribbon.
Oh, yeah. So, but no, you guys have had some fascinating discussions there. I'm going to show you something here. I think you guys would all recognize.
Nice. Is that a first printing?
Oh, do you think I would be touching it?
Well, you're not. It's under glass.
First printing of this cover is considered the most valuable piece of paper, of American literary paper. Now, it probably, the people who sold Superman could argue about it, but I just know that I tried to read it when I was a kid. And then I got a podcast that talked about who was Jay Gatsby. It was this whole concept. And then I knew more about the book. God, I look like a ghost. And then zombie ghost. And I read the book, and all I could think of was, my God, why is this? High school kids are not ready for this. They don't understand it, but I tell you, everybody has a um, you know, somebody like that if they're lucky. But looking at my picture, though, I am reminded of one thing. And someone on Facebook wrote something that I know that there's 17 writers out there now working on.
Hmm.
It says, "Can a single individual become a zombie and a ghost at the same
Oh, I
time?"
love that. Yeah.
Yeah, and all I can think of is, oh God, yeah, that that is going to be published by somebody. And I
Yeah.
look at myself in this picture, and it's like, wow, I am the cover art.
Yeah, but which are you, the ghost or the zombie? But yeah, the original meme has the ghost looking down at the zombie because please, come on, we were a lawyer for God's sake. Stop shambling around,
Yeah, I mean, do you realize that's a Supreme Court justice you're reading?
Yes.
That's a start.
That could be a good thing, depending on which judge.
Yeah, like the old joke, what do you call it when a busload of lawyers drives off a cliff?
Start.
A good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, bad jokes, I know. But I've been enjoying your conversation as I've been wondering, Yana. You noticed I had to leave there for a bit. I made my wife fresh muffins this morning, and when the dinger dings for muffins, you go.
For whom the dinger dings.
Yeah, that's not for who the dinger dings. Who it dings for you. But Cheryl likes it. But in all of this, I mean, you really hit some of the concepts that says what I love about it was just the literature or the art or whatever that just sticks with you. Be it, I mean, for me, the first adult, well, I will call adult science fiction or modern science fiction that I read as an adult was The Forever War. And I was in the military at the time. Vietnam was so firm in our memories. And when I read it, it just stuck with me that wow. Um, and the you guys talked a lot about Ursula K. Le Guin. I have to admit, I was never as big a fan there, but the Dragon Riders of Pern just totally absorbed me, and I loved it every minute of it, and all of the interminable uh, books that came after. So, well, there were a lot of them. You got to admit.
I'm laughing because it's true.
I mean, someday there's going to be, when the zombie apocalypse happens, and all I've got to build my wall of protection with is books, and I only get to pick 2 series. I think I'm going to take Dune and Pern, and
you could build a house out of those.
I'll build my wall. So if I survive and get bored, I at least have quality reading.
Yeah, there you go.
God, it's just so good to have you guys on. And then I promised I was going to tell you guys what's up. At BQ Press, we can do quick and we can do long.
Yeah, I've noticed both of these tendencies.
Yeah, but we have put, looking back on the history, BQ Press got started when me and a bottle of rye watched the election and said, "Oh my God, me and half a bottle of rye whiskey survived it." And then when Trump was getting inaugurated, it was like, oh God. And so we decided to do a anthology, published it 100 days later.
Which is insane if you know anything about publishing.
Yeah. And it's been a fair number of time doing well. And now we are just getting ready to release on June 1st a wonderful book. It's got a brand new story by David Gerald. It's got award-winning Liam Hogan um, from it. It's a British writer, talented, wonderful guy, and some fine poetry. And it's called Madam President. It explores the concept of Madam President. Now, not President of the United States in all the cases. That'd be some boring stories. But the idea that the whatever the office is, whatever the organization is, a woman is the leader. And we have a woman leading her homeowners organization as they fight off a local incursion by aliens. You
I
know?
want to read that one.
Oh yeah, and the aliens have no respect for the ordinances about how many colors you can have in the lawn. I mean, for example, you're not allowed to use pink and red in your flower beds, and their evisceration of was determined of a resident was determined to be a violation of the local ordinance. And you guys know you can piss off a lot of people, but never the homeowners association. So that is all fun, and that is part of what I was doing when this podcast started was saying, "Dear writer, I'm sorry I swapped out your biography with one of a gardener from Australia. I'll not do that again." Uh, and Deborah knows what I'm talking about. All the little things that you can have go wrong that you thought were right at the beginning and you never checked them again, and then all of a sudden, boom, you're at the end, and it's like, oh, how did that happen? So anyway, that's going to be out on June 2nd. And on June 2nd, we're going to have several writers are going to join us for the Sunday brunch
Nice.
and discuss it. And it will be a hoot. And Deborah Godfrey, I don't know how many of you guys know Deborah, but Deborah is she's a talented writer and a talented organizer.
Mm.
And if you've ever been to Rainforest, you'll know what an organizer she is. She is just great people. And so we have that one coming out. And then right after that, it's a race to see who gets their first Scott's Planet, which both of your two, the
We're
other
the poets
two
of
guys
Scott's Planet.
here are both in. And then we have coming after that alternative leaders. I mean, no, Southern Alternative Truths Southern Edition.
Which I actually have prose in as opposed to poetry.
We have what?
I have a prose story in that.
Yeah, it's you and Deborah still need, or you and Karen still need to talk. It's edited by Karen Anderson, and but I'm just doing my one story from each and working my way down the editing process, and it's a joy to read some of these stories, and so you got to think. I mean, Alternative Truths Southern Edition, and we've got the subtitle "Bless Their Hearts," is a hoot, and we are enjoying the heck out of it.
I set my story in my native Memphis, Tennessee. In a balkanized United States where the Southern.
Well, I may, and we got, and in that one we've got David Gerald, Adam Troy Castro, you, I think Andrew, you're in there, right?
Scott's Planet.
Huh?
In
No,
Scott's
he's not in the alternative.
And
truth.
Lou Berger, yeah.
So what you're saying is Adam Troy Castro and David Gerald are slumming it by being with me in a book.
No, I don't think so. You know what? There's one thing I love about those two guys. There is no slumming for those guys. You're a fellow writer. They treat you right. In fact, who here knows Mark Tufo of him?
Mhm.
Mark Tufo is the number one zombie writer. Um, I just happened to one day pick up one of his zombie books because I don't read zombie, and I said, "Oh wow, this is enormously funny. I mean, and well written."
Nice.
And a guy who refuses to kill the family bulldog that weighs 60 pounds. He's always carrying it around to get it out of harm's way. And he's got some of the most memorable characters you'll ever want to see. Um, and he just published, I think, book 24 in the series, which, if you can keep a series fresh for 24 books, you're good.
Especially as keeping it fresh when so many of the characters are busy decomposing.
Yeah, and he's not afraid to kill somebody.
Yeah.
The but I had him and David and Jim on at the same time, and he was talking about his early days as a writer, and he was talking about all the rejection slips he got. David turned to him on screen in the most straightforward manner I've ever seen. What is this rejection slip you're talking about?
Wow.
It's an urban legend.
Huh?
It's an urban legend.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh,
I
you should
mean,
see my bathroom. I wallpapered it in rejection slips.
Oh, I once kept an envelope full for all my rejection slips, 8.5 by 11. I said, when I can't get any more in there, I'll quit writing. Um, I guess I'm lucky I didn't do that
We're all lucky.
because I ran out of room and I kept going after it. And you know what happened that made it work? I used to be a con runner kind of person, and I didn't realize how much time that was taking. Within 2 years of stopping running cons, I'd sold something like 8 short stories and had 2 books published. So,
There you go.
advice for new writers: um, maybe if you got some other activity that got you into writing that you really like, but you really want to focus on your writing, maybe lighten up on the other activity and focus on your writing. It takes focus. For me, it did. So, what's your closing comments?
So I'm going to ask my guests if they want to plug any particular book or story. And while they're thinking about that, I'll point out one more story that stuck with me. The late Terry Bisson was one of my writing teachers at Clarion, and unlike every other teacher in that 6-week program, he assigned reading, and the reading he assigned was this. The Good Shepherd by C.S. Forester as an example of world building, because a Navy flotilla in World War II is a very strange environment. And so but it stuck with me, partly because it was Terry teaching it and offering insights into it. But I had not read it prior to Clarion, and it was fabulous as a story and riveting, but also deeply strange. Compared to like regular normal life in terms of the world it is. So that's my last one that sticks to me. And the only books I would plug are the forthcoming Scott's Planet and Alternative Truth Southern Edition, which will both feature my pieces.
And we're targeting both of those for early October. Did you hear God laugh?
You know, there's a Yiddish expression that translates into English as "man plans and God laughs." It rhymes in English, but in Yiddish. But yeah. So, Andrew or Deborah, do you want to plug anything that you have out or that's coming out soon?
I just got up to get a copy of. Cliff mentioned this earlier. collaborators. I don't know if it's reversed or not.
It is, but
Yeah.
that's okay.
It is
If
anyway.
it's backwards, all you do is click the little gear button and then hit the mirror, the video, and then hit the mirror video thing.
I'm not seeing it. It doesn't
Don't worry
matter.
about it.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. You recognize the space person and then the Renaissance building. So this was, I think this is one of the best things I've done. It's an occupation and resistance novel on a planet where the native race is gender fluid. And it's also misunderstandings compounding drastically, and people of goodwill on both sides trying to find a solution, and eventually they do. And so it's got a blurb by an unsolicited blurb by C.J. Cherry, who loved it, and J.M. Fry described it as a romantic and intellectually sexy gender discussion wrapped up in a compelling novel. And I think she nailed it, or they nailed it. I'm not sure the right pronoun. Anyway, so it came out a while ago, but it's still one of the best things I've done.
And it was a finalist for the Lambda.
It was. I got to go to New York and attend the ceremony. It was very exciting.
And Andrew, I saw you pull a few books off your shelf.
Yeah. I have a poem in Scott's Planet. It's coming out
In October, apparently.
Here's another VQ Press in reverse. Alternative Holidays, which is the anthology that first introduced me to Bob.
And you have a poem in there, a really good one.
I do, a long one.
A long one, like 14 pages.
This is Durham and Rose. It's a
Even
novel
longer.
made up of 61 poems. Poetry collection, Kite Shadows and Smaller Secrets. This is the most recent poetry collection, Feathers, Wax, and Dreams. And I'm about 3/4 way through another poetry collection I'm putting together called Eulogies for the Living. And I'm struggling to finish the last chapter of The Avenue of Bones.
Which is his novel set in Tokugawa Shogunate, Japan.
But I'm looking forward to Scott's Planet.
So am I. I wonder how it's going to come out. Now, before I go, everybody wave at the comments section, because our award-winning British novelist Liam Hogan has stepped into the comment section today, because I'm editing his story that as it's an old trope, but extraordinarily well done. And I'm enjoying it. And Liam, never mind all the comments; they're just friendly suggestions.
So we're going to see Liam on the podcast at some point, aren't we?
Oh, God, yeah. We should. Because you know what? I've never actually met him, I don't believe. But I know he's a scientist, technical kind of guy.
Perfect.
And he's forgotten more about things than I ever knew. Oh, my God. His keyboard is melting. He's typing so fast. We should get off before he comes on and says, I'm never writing for you again. But anyway, thank you all for coming. And you know who we got up next week? It's the last Sunday of the month. And on the last Sunday of the month, David Gerald and Jim Wright come on and share rants. It's been fun. Now, a bad thing happened last Sunday. Jim had something kept him from showing up. And oh my God, you do not want to unfetter Jim or David when it comes to rants. Without Jim there to keep him in line, he was wow. So I am looking forward to see how they do this week.
Sure.
They won't let me disappear on the podcast like I do with you guys. Jim says it's like It's your show, Bob. You stay. So
well, you just sneak off whenever I'm running the show. So.
Oh, well, you see, you are so talented, and the guests you bring are such iconic literary creatures that with me here, I mean, I simply suck the life out of the room, and they have to work harder to keep it filled, and they do. So you guys have fun. This has been B Cube Sunday morning, and I love that y'all all showed up.